Admiral Walsh, Admiral Fargo, Governor Abercrombie, survivors of Pearl Harbor, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be here today to commemorate the attack on Pearl Harbor and remember those who fought and died in defense of our country 69 years ago today. President Roosevelt declared December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. But each year since 1958, the survivors of Pearl Harbor have faithfully gathered here to remind us that December 7, 1941 is also a date that will live in the annals of heroism and freedom. They come here to remember the 2,390 men who, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, gave the last full measure of devotion to their country that day. They come here to remember those who have carried the wounds of battle since that day. They come here to remember those whose final resting place is under the waters of this harbor. We are humbled to be in the presence of over 100 survivors here today. We thank you for your service to our country. Those of us who are older know well the story of Pearl Harbor. Some lived through it. Some of us born later learned of it from the tales of our parents and grandparents. For all of us, December 7th is Pearl Harbor Day because the events that occurred here on that Sunday morning in late 1941 were so traumatic, so world-shaking, so marked by tragedy and heroism that they are ingrained in our nation's consciousness. That day is now fundamental to who we are as a people. Its stories must be preserved, they must be honored, and they must be shared. Today, we dedicate an extraordinary new visitor center to preserve our memories. Its exhibits and presentations go beyond dates, events, and battles. It recognizes that Pearl Harbor is ultimately about people, about individual sailors, airmen, soldiers, civilians, and families who woke up on a Sunday morning to find themselves in a hellish battlefield with bombs, smoke, fire, confusion, and mayhem everywhere. For heroism that day, the United States awarded 16 Congressional Medals of Honor, 51 Navy Crosses, 53 Silver Crosses, 4 Navy and Marine Corps medals, 1 Distinguished Flying Cross, 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, and 3 Bronze Stars. I want to briefly share some of the stories of the Medal of Honor winners who gave their lives that day. On December 7, 1941, Captain Mervyn Binion was the commanding officer of the USS West Virginia. Mortally wounded on the bridge of his ship, Captain Binion refused to be carried from the bridge. Instead, he used one arm to close his wounds while continuing to lead his men in defending his ship. Ensign Herbert Jones was on duty on the USS California when the attack began. He dived into a smoke-filled hatchway and crawled along oil-slick decks to rescue a stricken sailor before being temporarily overcome by fumes. When he came to, Ensign Jones saw an anti-aircraft battery without a leader, and staggering to his feet, he took command. He was killed by a bomb while leading his men as they brought ammunition from below deck. Seaman First Class J. Richard Webb was on the USS Oklahoma when it took 3 torpedo hits. Even as the ship listed and began to capsize, Seaman Webb stayed on duty in his turret, holding a flashlight that allowed his shipmates to escape. He sacrificed his life so that others might live. These men symbolize the heroism of that day and of the many battles that would follow on the Pacific Front. It was, as Admiral Chester Nimitz would say, a day when uncommon valor was a common virtue. Today, the National Park Service is entrusting with honoring, preserving, and telling these stories. It is a mission that we carry out at the 393 parks, battlefields, monuments, and other units that make up the National Park System. Yorktown, Gettysburg, the Grand Canyon, Acadia. Through our stewardship of these special places, we weave together the tapestry of our long history, our rich culture, and our beautiful land. We do not tell this story alone. Across the nation, thousands of friends groups, volunteers, and other philanthropic and community organizations support our parks and ensure that visitors enjoy the best possible facilities and interpretive programs. On behalf of Secretary Salazar, I want to thank all the donors, volunteers, and other supporters who have made it possible to dedicate a world-class visitor center here at Pearl Harbor, and in particular, the Navy. This new visitor center will serve as a gateway not just to December 7, 1941, but to all of World War II. Visitors entering this center travel from the terrible destruction of Pearl Harbor to the moment of triumph on the deck of the Missouri. They will learn why Japan attacked and how the United States and its allies responded. Visitors will hear from eyewitnesses about the attack on Oahu and its terrible aftermath, battles where brave men and women gave their lives for their country and for the cause of democracy and freedom around the globe. They will meet the individuals whose sacrifices made victory possible. The Visitor Center will bring history alive. I can imagine no greater addition to the National Park System than this Visitor Center that we dedicate here today. Today's ceremony is entitled A Promise Fulfilled, and it refers to a solemn commitment from the National Park Service, the United States Navy, and the Pearl Harbor Memorial Fund to the members of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. This solemn commitment is to ensure that future generations do not forget the message of Pearl Harbor. That's a message of continued vigilance and the terrible cost of war. As we fulfill this promise, there can be no greater honor than to be joined by the survivors of Pearl Harbor who are here today with their families. It is impossible for us to find words adequate to express the gratitude that we feel and our nation feels for your valor and your service. Year after year, you and other World War II veterans return here to commemorate the loss of friends and colleagues and to remember the struggle in which you served. Your unending commitment to our country has focused our nation's civic attention to our shared history and shared experiences. Today, I and all of us who are here want to assure you that you and your stories, and the stories of all of those who experienced those terrible hours and days, will be passed forward generation after generation. They will outlive us all. Thanks to your service and your commitment over the years, we will fulfill a promise made by Americans everywhere in those dark days after the attack. Remember Pearl Harbor. Today, with solemn hearts, we do remember Pearl Harbor, and we will make sure that we always remember Pearl Harbor. Thank you very much.